I'd like to begin with an observation made by the cultural historian Christopher Lasch. The proliferation of visual, auditory images in a society of the spectacle, as it has been described, encourages a kind of preoccupation with the self. People now respond to others as if their actions are being recorded and simultaneously transmitted to an unseen audience or stored up for close scrutiny at some later time. These prevailing conditions thus bring out narcissistic personality traits that were present in everyone. It's not hard to imagine what Lasch is writing about, is it? Surely he's another grumpy old man complaining about social media in general and Facebook in particular. There will be lots of literary eye-rolling about the estimated 1.8 billion self-portraits that appear on Instagram, Snapchat and WhatsApp each day. Like the parents of any teenager, he'll no doubt bemoan the fact that young adults spend up to a third of their waking lives staring at the smartphones that contain all their images. Finally, there'll be the more general, "it wasn't like that in my day," bellyaching about unicorn aspirations, staggering lack of empathy, and a breathtaking sense of entitlement. That is, after all, what the selfie generation is all about, isn't it? You might expect all this from a middle-aged white male, until, that is, you find out that Lasch's observations were published in 1979. That's 24 years before Facebook went public, 28 years before the first iPhone, and at least 3 years before the vast majority of those who might otherwise be described as millennial were even born. Lasch's observations about our cultural obsession with the self, they predate social media because for the last 200 years, the Western way of conceiving truth, beauty and goodness has been grounded in the activities of the individual. Our social media is merely a megaphone for the modern anthem, "I did it my way." This all started around the middle of the 1600s with the French philosopher René Descartes, who came to prominence in the salons of Paris through his attempts to reason his way to absolute truth. As a rational skeptic, Descartes conducted a thought experiment in which he tried doubting everything, every possible source of truth, until he came to the realisation that the only thing that he couldn't doubt was the fact that he was doubting or thinking. So he concluded, "Cogito ergo sum." I doubt, think, therefore I am. Now that may not sound like the most groundbreaking discovery of the ages, but for Europeans living in the shadow of the 30 Years' War, one of the continent's bloodiest periods of religious violence, people were heartily sick of absolute claims backed by religious authority or divine mandate. A new way needed to be found whereby the truth of the world could be available to anyone, and it appeared that Descartes had come to the rescue. From now on, any rational person could determine truth, beauty and goodness for themselves, simply by using the powers of reason. The thinking self displaced God in the Western mind, as the means by which all the problems of human society could be solved. While Descartes' philosophy was widely influential throughout Europe at the time, not everyone was happy with all the consequences that it brought about. For instance, Descartes' rational approach to the universe had a distinctly mechanistic or machine-like feel that impinged upon at least undermined, the newly found sense of freedom that people had over the world. Descartes' universe was a very mechanistic one. In 1687, Isaac Newton's Principia was first published, and in a single stroke, humankind achieved the ability to show that things that occurred in the heavens operated by the same laws as things that happened on the earth. Newton's theories added to this picture of an entirely predictable, if not mechanical, view of the universe that gave the thinking self the ability to control nature. Enter the Romantics. During an era of political revolution, with slogans of liberty, equality and fraternity, along with their general aversion to mechanistic views of life and later naturalistic determinism. Romantics drew great inspiration from the rugged individualists of history and ultimately the geniuses that appeared in every age, whether it was Homer or Aristotle or Leonardo da Vinci. Learning and education were worthy, but the genius inspired them because he was truly original, in line with their desire for new beginnings. The genius had imagination unbounded, but also the ability to mediate to us, through his art, something of the divine spark that dwelt within. More generally in Germany, and thanks to a heritage of pietism mixed with a Protestant work ethic, that cultivated woman or man developed their Bildung, that innate drive towards perfection, their self-image. This was something akin to evolution for the person, yet it was still governed by the will of the meditative soul. The romantic self is the choosing self, and one of the most enduringly influential proponents of the choosing self was the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard focused on the importance of the individual exercising their will over and against the homogenising nature of modern culture. From his pen flowed eventually the existentialist movement of the 1920s, with their catch cries of personal authenticity and the relentless necessity for individual freedom. Now, of course, the struggle for personal liberty in such an environment makes self-expression and self-determination not at all a foregone conclusion. So the Romantics wandered in the forests or trekked through the mountains, seeking new experiences and authentic expressions of old ones. Even failing in all this, gained a certain romantic integrity, with tragedy and melancholy being highest atop their list of virtues. They're the original emo kids. It is from within the context of modern romantic German culture that we find the star of tonight's show, theologian, conspirator and martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Born February 4, 1906, as the fourth and youngest son to a rising young professor of psychiatry and a highly artistic mother with aristocratic pedigree, Bonhoeffer's formative years were aesthetic, intellectual and urbane. Schooled by the best that Kaiser Wilhelm's state had to offer, and on the cusp of manhood, the young Bonhoeffer followed the great romantic pilgrimage to visit Rome. Despite not wandering through darkened forests nor trekking across rugged Alps, the young would-be theologian ascended the stairs of St. Peter's to behold the marvellous pomp of a Vatican Palm Sunday celebration. Now, amidst the vast throng gathered there, peoples, tribes and nations, there Bonhoeffer recalls a moment of revelation as he glimpsed for the first time a truly universal church and his own particular place in it. The concept of the self and its place in the church was a consistent theme throughout Bonhoeffer's major writings. His doctoral dissertation entitled Communion of the Saints, his habilitation entitled Act and Being, and his unfinished ethics all interacted one way or another with modernity's quest for the authentic or best self. In an age where maintaining our personal brand via the hyper-reality of social media can be a full-time occupation, Bonhoeffer's thoughts on Christ, the church and the self are a welcome reality check. For Bonhoeffer, to know God is to know ultimate reality. What is real cannot be abstractly separated from God, but the real has its reality only in God. One knows the reality of the world when it's understood in relation to God. Furthermore, The reality of God is not just another idea, for the reality of God has been revealed and testified to itself in the centre of the real world. And I quote here from Bonhoeffer, "In Jesus Christ, the reality of God has been received in the reality of this world." Now, what may seem like a circularity is explained by the contention that it's not possible to speak of either the reality of God or the reality of the world without speaking of Jesus Christ. It's not possible to speak about a real world, and it's not possible to speak about the real God without speaking of Jesus Christ. Here's another quote from Bonhoeffer's Ethics. "In Christ, the offer meets us to recognise a share in the reality of God and the reality of the world together, not one without the other. The reality of God opens itself in the same way that it puts me completely in the reality of the world. However, I find the reality of the world always already born, adopted and reconciled in the reality of God." It's in the person of Christ that the reality of God and the reality of the world are met at the same time. The key thing to note here for the first part of this evening is the concept of being met in Christ. If we want to understand the reality of ourselves in the world, then the first question to ask is who, but not so much who am I. In his early work, Act and Being, Bonhoeffer was especially concerned to establish how we ought to speak about knowledge within the context of Western philosophy, dominated as it is by the concept of self-consciousness, whether it's the thinking self or the choosing self that we're talking about. In Bonhoeffer's assessment, regardless of whether one starts with the thinking self or the choosing self, human rationality is unable to conceive appropriately the truth about the world and its meaning. If we try to understand the truth from the perspective of the thinking self, says Bonhoeffer, and I quote, "Epistemology is the attempt of the I to understand itself. I reflect on myself, I and myself move apart and come together again. We understand ourselves from within the limits of our own reason. Yet approached this way, says Bonhoeffer, the self is constantly directed in reference to itself, without ever being able to get to itself. It's like a snake trying to swallow itself. Our attempts to understand ourselves purely from the perspective of ourselves must collapse, because individually we're not self-sustaining. We're always in reference to some other. The autonomous thinking self ends up being locked inside its own reason, completely cut off from anything objective. We can't get outside of ourselves to judge ourselves by any standard, since there's no other standard than ourselves. If we try to understand the truth of our existence from the perspective of the choosing self, the reality of the world comes before the existence of the self, or at least thinking about the self. The challenge then is how the choosing self will grasp or comprehend the real world. In short, and in sympathy with the existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger, Bonhoeffer writes that the choosing self stumbles across itself in a world. It's ever already in a world. Now, what this means is that there's really nothing to choose. The world always and already exists. And while the choosing self might choose not to be in the world, it has no power over its appearance in the world. Another way of looking at it is to say that our absolute freedom over the world is severely limited by our lack of ability to choose when and how we come into the world, when we'll be born. If you can't choose that, you're a long way behind mastering the whole world. In the final analysis, Bonhoeffer concludes that both the thinking self and the choosing self have the same outcome. The I understands itself in a closed system. The modern self is, to borrow the phrase of Martin Luther, quo curvum in se, that is, the heart turned in on itself. The self cannot get out of itself to reach the truth. Instead, it must be met by Christ and placed into the truth. Not only is the self separated from God and the world, it has no way of reversing this situation alone. In this station, the self is constantly tempted by the question, how can I be placed in the truth about God and the world? But a better question, according to Bonhoeffer, is who? Who will place the self into the truth about God and the world? In his 1932 lectures on Christology, Bonhoeffer continues to attack the modern concept of the thinking self, establishing truth of the world for itself. He does this by describing Christ as the Gegenlogos. You're nobody in German theology if you don't invent your own word. The counter-reason. Christ is the counter-reason that confronts human rationality as its conqueror and judge. Bonhoeffer restyles John 14:6 like this: I am the truth. I'm the death of human rationality. I'm the life of God's reason. I'm the first and the last, writes Bonhoeffer of Christ. Christ as the Gegenlogos overwhelms the confines of human rationality, such the only appropriate response from the aspiring self is that of Paul onto the road to Damascus. Who are you, Lord? Christ the Gegenlogos refuses to be classified and hence encapsulated by human reason, even though human reason continues to seek the conditions for the possibility of doing just that. Hence, the risen, living Christ turns the question back on his examiner. Who are you then, you that so ask? Are you the truth that you so ask? Who are you? You can only ask about me because through me you are justified and divinely gifted. The autonomous self is confronted out of the truth by the one who is ultimately the truth. Christ becomes the boundary over which human rationality cannot cross. The autonomous individual is displaced from the position of ordering reality in her own way because she meets Christ for me, in my place, where I should stand. As he stands in the individual's place, Christ becomes the limit of her existence. And I quote again, he, Christ, stands at the boundary of my existence and still in my place. That is an expression for the fact that I am separated from the I that I should be by an inexceedable boundary. The boundary lies between my old self and the new I, thus in the centre between me and me. As the boundary, Christ is at the same time my recovered centre. In Bonhoeffer's schema, Christ meets the individual as the person in the right place with God and exposes the individual's closedness towards God, that they have displaced God as the centre of meaning and truth in the world. Now, to our culturally sensitive ears, Bonhoeffer's portrait of Christ, the counter-reason, confronting the self, seems aggressive to the point of violence. Where are the trigger warnings, you might say? What about safe spaces for the self from Christ? However, Christ does not confront me in order to cut me off from the truth, from God. Instead, Christ confronts me pro me, as Bonhoeffer described it, for me. He is the one who mediates the possibility of a new creation to a present experience in fallenness. Not only that, he mediates God to the individual and the individual to God. Christ is more than I am as an individual can be for myself before God, but at the same time, all that I need to be with God. As Prome, Christ brings the knowledge of ultimate reality to us and for us as a gift. In the end, Christ confronts the modern self and drags it out into the open light of God's grace. What happens here when the individual meets Christ, Bonhoeffer asks? Here I quote again, "An ultimate thing, a touching of no human being doing or suffering, the dark human life, barred from inside and outside, always deep in an abyss and hopelessness, losing itself in the pit, is torn open with power. The word of God breaks in. The human recognises God and the neighbour for the first time in redeeming light. The cor curvum in se is invaded by Christ, torn out from the imprisonment of one's own eye, liberated in Jesus Christ. The individual is given the gift of faith in the offer to receive a share in the reality of God and the reality of the world together, not one without the other." Bonhoeffer's description has a strongly apocalyptic feel, as autonomous reason is confronted with its inadequacy, not by looking at itself, but by recognising God as the redeemer of its closedness in Christ. In a manner highly reminiscent of Luther's theology of the cross, Bonhoeffer describes human glory coming to its ultimate end in the image of the battered, bleeding, spat upon, crucified one. Here on the cross, God shows me what my aspirations for a best self actually achieve: the death of his Son. The autonomous self is confronted with its closeness, its sin, in the form of the crucified Christ. His broken and bloodied form is the limit of our aspirations, all that we could be for ourselves. Whether it's the thinking self or the choosing self, they are both locked in a downward spiral of closeness to God that is revealed in all its horror by God in the crucified Christ. In the final analysis, Bonhoeffer's encouragement to us of the self-regeneration is that our best self is a gift of God in the person and work of Jesus the Christ. The resurrected Christ is the ultimate in human existence, the absolute pinnacle of all that we might dare to be, and God keeps him for us as the promise. The risen Christ is kept in trust for us until the day of his return. Bonhoeffer wrote, "Christian life means being human in the power of Christ's becoming human, being judged and pardoned in the power of the cross, living a new life in the power of the resurrection. The end of my quest for truth as either the thinking self or the choosing self is put before me in Jesus Christ. In the midst of my aspirations, from before my strivings began, and long after I have the energy to continue, God presents the offer to me of a self reopened, reconditioned, reinstalled in the world with God and with my neighbour. The offer comes when I'm met by Jesus the Christ as the centre of my existence. I see now who I am to Jesus Christ, but I still need to know where I can be so confronted, so conditioned, so completed. Those are the topics that we will pursue as Tony comes to speak to us. Who is the new me that's revealed when I'm confronted by Jesus Christ? And where does this happen? Where does Christ meet and confront us. Part 2 of our meeting will take place in a few minutes, but before that we thought we should allow some time for people to ask questions of clarification and explore what I've been saying for the past 20 minutes or so.
Okay, I told you it'd be a stretching, didn't I? Who wants to ask any questions of clarification or understanding? I've got a couple that I wrote down here, but any questions or thoughts just to David on his exposition of how Bonhoeffer both attacked the modern idea of the self and showed a different way? I'm going to repeat each question just so we have it on the tape as well. You mentioned Bonhoeffer's trip to Rome. Did that have any sort of further or ongoing influence on his development as a theologian, and how did he interact with Rome in a sense?
In brief, one of the costs of his upbringing was a pretty closed, confined, liberal Protestant view of the church and the world. And so when he went to Rome, it wasn't so much the flashiness of the Vatican Incorporate that caught his eye. It was the ordinary reality that there were people from all over the world gathered here at this Mass. There were cardinals who were black and yellow and white. There were believers from all over the world. And it seems, according to his own correspondence, that he sort of had a world-expanding moment and got a true sense of what the Bible talks about when it talks about people from every nation, tongue and tribe being gathered together at the foot of Christ, a truly universal picture of the church. And it seemed that that had a pretty significant effect on him. For example, he went back to Tübingen and did his doctoral studies, and at the end of that he was eligible to go out and pursue some kind of ministry training, the kind of thing that we might equate with like being a curate or assistant minister at a church. But instead of just going to, a society church that his layer of society would have afforded to him, he moved to Barcelona and worked with a German expatriate community there. And it comes out less in Metaxas's biography. It's a bit more prominent in Betke's original one. But it seems like that experience of really moving out of the upper echelon of German culture and out of the romantic world in which he lived, that kind of caught him up. And he was quite changed about that. And some people would say that there was a definite tilt away from his refined, reasonable, liberal Protestantism towards a very definite activist evangelicalism.
The question is, given Bonhoeffer's radical critique of the modern self, how does it end up that in South American-style liberation theology, Bonhoeffer becomes something of an inspiration? It's interesting. One of the funny things about Bonhoeffer, the interesting things about him, is that so many people claim him as their inspiration. He's one of those people everyone wants to be his friend, I think. But how did the liberation theology people claim him?
Gustav Gutierrez's work on liberation theology, which came out in the mid-60s, late 50s, I'm thinking. Everybody loved Bonhoeffer in the 60s because of his religionless Christianity concept. Now, that came out in some correspondence between him and his friend Betke, and to a certain extent, what Bonhoeffer was actually talking about was the way in which Christianity was going to have to refashion itself in a remade Europe after the Second World War. But as that concept of a religionless Christianity was grasped by all manner of people, I think the liberationists and Gutierrez in particular, they liked the aspect of Bonhoeffer as kind of a social agitator. After all, he has this blue blood life, but he ends up as a conspirator in a prison, in a political prison, working against the state. Now, if you know anything about the permanent revolution mantra of Marxism, that's got a pretty thick overflow with liberation theology, and I suspect theologians like Gutierrez used Bonhoeffer as a way of legitimising what was at times a pretty strong dalliance with Marxism, straight out.
Now, that's a challenge to summarise that. Obvious affinities between Kierkegaard and Bonhoeffer in their existentialist view of the importance of the choice and of the relative distance between the self and Christ. How influenced by Kierkegaard is Bonhoeffer? What are the differences between them? Can you tease out some of those distinctions? Is that a fair summary? Yeah. Thank you.
The choosing self is my summary term for an alternative stream of Western thought as distinct from rationalism. And it's a bit of an umbrella term, and in a context like this and after a question like that, it's obviously a contentious one. However, Bonhoeffer read a fair bit of Kierkegaard, and like every early 20th century existentialist, Martin Heidegger as well, what they thought they saw Kierkegaard saying, that is, if I've understood Bonhoeffer reading Heidegger reading Kierkegaard, is what they were focused on was the emergence of the act of becoming being essential for self, and particularly the activity of the self in choosing, for want of a better term, as the primary becoming, as opposed to, that is, becoming in terms of how I change, right? Part of this stuff sounds weird because there's a lot of continental technical terminology from philosophy going on. So if you feel like it's going over your head, that's okay. I'll just talk to my brother here for a few minutes and you guys can join in if you like. So the event of becoming makes a translation in Kierkegaard's work over and against, say, the giant idealist picture of Hegel's view of history. Bonhoeffer, likewise against Hegel, thinks Kierkegaard's my friend. I will go with the active choosing self as a manifestation of becoming. We could probably follow that up later.
Sounds good. No, it does sound good. Follow that up later. I was going to say, a few people are going, that's all right. The more you read Bonhoeffer and explore the background to his thought, there are worlds within worlds. There's a conversation going on that David's just given us a glimpse into that's been going on for hundreds of years in Western culture about who we really are and how we make sense of the world, given that we've now abandoned God and decided we're going to do it entirely on our own resources. And the two streams that he's been teasing us through, the stream that says we'll do that purely by thinking and reasoning our way towards it, and the other that says we're going to choose and will our way to being authentic and real. Those are in our bloodstream. They're in our cultural bloodstream. That's the question I was going to ask. Of those two streams, the more rationalist thinking way of working out who I am, or the more choosing way, what's dominant now, do you think, in our culture? Are we mainly romantics or are we mainly rationalists? And what do you think Bonhoeffer's critique of our culture would be then if he were here?
My theory is that currently the choosing self is on the rise. The choosing self dominates popular media. The choosing self is Hollywood. The choosing self is Apple. And the power of the choosing self is free market capitalism, because people get really rich out of giving the choosing self exactly what it wants.
So by accumulating all these things around ourselves, by gathering our choices into a little circle like a bowerbird around us, we say, this is who I am.
Yeah. The whole concept of I life, Steve Jobs is the quintessential romantic genius. Never a wrong idea, always out there on the edge. Think different is his motto. And he becomes a megastar, worshipped in his own campus. And his company is now the largest one in the world. All they do is get people in developing worlds to build things that we already have and sell them far more expensively than we actually need. But we love it.
Just some rough dates to sort of situate Bonhoeffer in his context. When did he live? When did he die? When did he write this stuff?
What did I say? Born on February 4, 1906. So he's a pre-war child. He's at high school during the First World War, and his big trip to Rome is in 1922 during the Spanish flu, as he takes his great romantic adventure. During the 20s, he's at university the first time, goes to Barcelona, I think in 1929, comes back to Berlin, and in the early 30s does his habilitation, which is the postgraduate study that German academics do to make them worthy of teaching at a university. And he's giving his lectures on creation and fall, in the building outside which the Nazis are burning books. So when you go to Berlin, you'll see the memorial next to the book burning, which is just down the road from Bonhoeffer's memorial. And at that time, Humboldt University had buildings in which Bonhoeffer is teaching Genesis 1 to 3.
So yeah, that's the time frame. And obviously the arrest during the war and the death in the last days of the Second World War.